Joining everyone on our weekly AJ Zoom event. Welcome to everyone who's watching live on Zoom, as well as to those who are hearing the replay on J Air Community Radio and on YouTube, and those watching on Facebook Live. My name's Robert Gregory, and on the screen we've got AJ President Dr. David Adler, as well as our guest for tonight, who doesn't need any introduction, former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. I'm sure many people know him quite well and listen to his podcast, which is one of the most popular in Australia. The format for tonight will be an interview style with Dr. Adler and Mr. Anderson. And if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand with the raising hand function. We may go to some new people rather than the regulars, but let's see how we go. So over to you, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert, and the Honourable John Anderson AC. Thank you so much for your time in joining us this evening, and welcome to AJA, albeit virtually. John, I know you've made a lot of commentary on the big social issues. It's been said that the important values of Western civilization are not being valued. How do you see where we're at the moment, and particularly in Australia?
I believe that we are at a civilizational moment, nothing less than a civilizational moment. As I look around the world today, it seems to me that we thought four totalitarian regimes with little in common with one another, other than their dislike, even loathing of the West and our values, those being China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. But I think you have to now add to that the truly troubling and quite totalitarian by nature amalgam that is emerging between progressive activists and extreme Islamists around the world and within the West itself. As Konstantin Kisin put it in London a while ago, we knew the barbarians were at the gate. We didn't realize they were right in our midst. Now, there have been many great civilizations down through the ages. They've all, if you like, resulted from great and powerful ideas. The better the ideas, the more civilized the civilization has been. But we are all, in the cultures that we live in, benefiting from those who have gone before us and who have had big ideas. Over time, history tells us that civilizations run short on the fuel which fired them up and kept them going in the first place. The powerful ideas agreed to by enough people in that community to make them work together to keep the machine going. And faced with that rundown of fuel, you've either got to refuel it with what you started with, or find an alternative fuel, or pass into oblivion like other civilizations have done before us. And when you look around, we're living through a revolution. That which used to be on the top is now on the bottom. That which was on the bottom was on the top. And you know, our culture is deeply derived from the Jewish and Christian traditions, particularly the view that every individual has worth and dignity. You don't find that anywhere else. And everything that flows from that, the common law, the vote, it goes on and on and on. The way in which we have, if you like, a covenantal view of government comes from Exodus. Let my people go. Slavery will end. We will, out in the desert, enter into a covenant. You will bring some things to the table. I will bring some things to the table. The idea of subsidiarity, do what you can do for yourself best and ask your neighbor to do what they can do for themselves and for you for best. Don't push it up to the next level. Don't allow government to become God, if you like. We're abandoning, or we have abandoned all of that. And I, as a great lover of Western democratic freedoms and prosperity, in the latter part of my life, I'm absolutely committed to do all I can to say, let's wake up before it's too late.
John, I'll ask you a little bit more about that in a moment, but obviously the issue which has been quite dominant to concern for the Jewish community has been the events of 7th of October and subsequently, not just what's happened in Israel, but also the reaction locally. some people are saying that this has actually exposed the civilizational war. It's a bigger thing happening than Israel versus Hamas in Gaza. Do you agree with that proposition in view of the extraordinary reactions we've seen on the ground all around the world?
I would not in any way want to diminish the horrors of October the 7th, the sheer barbarity of it, the unbelievable state of mind that allows evil men to rejoice in their brutality, the latter day inheritors really of the Nazi tradition of gassing Jews. But so deranged are they that they boast of it. The Germans at least sought to hide from their fellow Germans and the rest of the world what they were up to. They had some conscience, whereas as we know, these people were rejoicing in it. Now, the fact that that can be brushed aside, the fact that right across the West we have activists, and let's be frank about this, many quite well-educated people from what were once known as the well-informed middle classes, who are prepared to turn a blind eye to that barbarity and not recognize the terrible strand of tradition that it derives from, the most ancient and evil hatreds of all, tells you, I think, more than perhaps even you've suggested, it tells you that we've hollowed ourselves out in a way that is truly frightening. And I find it hard to express the apparent, it's not just somehow non-functioning moral compass. It's as though many of our leaders, today's elites, can't even find a moral compass, let alone any courage to go with it. And all of this can only happen because we don't know our history. It could not happen if there wasn't a void left by the absence of an understanding of the history of our culture, and indeed it reflects not only a lack of teaching, I suspect, but also pretty dedicated revisionist history often when it has been taught.
Indeed. But do you think that explains what we're seeing on our university campuses, the protests in the street, that has been huge and aggressive, and and the aggression on social media, etc. Is there something more going on than just a lack of historical knowledge?
David, it's my view that this most ancient of hatreds, I mean, racism is hatred of one person for another, based on some racial difference. And hatred is at the heart of all of humanity's problems from beginning to end. And I think I would have to say to you, I can't explain precisely what it is, but I think it does go beyond the cultural moment. I think this goes to something strangely irrational, perhaps even cosmic, in the way in which the Jewish people have been so often maligned. I don't understand it. I don't pretend to, but I think that precisely that in a way is the point, that it's not rational. It's almost sort of supernatural. And part of being civilized, if I can put it this way, is to rise above that sort of level of misguided emotionalism and move to a place of reason and of rationality, and of clear-headedness about where the real dividing line between good and evil lies. Because we've now, I think, refined the idea of good and evil being divided along racial ideas into something even more basic and stupid and evil, which is this victim oppressor model, this sort of cynical theory, I choose the word carefully, critical theory idea that has swamped our universities. The long march through the West has been highly successful, out of the universities, into the streets, into our schools, into the media, into politics, into business. that somehow or other it's all the great fault line between good and evil is not somewhere across every human heart, as any good Jewish or Christian scholar would understand, and any good child of the Enlightenment would understand. And so now we say we go back to some sort of pagan view that no, it's between victim and oppressor. And that's amazing that the victims always turn out to be anybody who's not white. Although, of course, the great irony is that many Jewish people are not particularly white themselves.
Correct. The Sephardi Jews that come from the Middle East, and in fact, probably a slight majority of the Jewish population of Israel is not white. And then
So
you've
there's
got the
another
dark
thing
ones.
that you and others and your listeners will be well aware of the utter hypocrisy, the utter mind-boggling hypocrisy of those who attempt to hide their anti-Semitism behind, oh, no, I've got nothing against Jews, I'm just against the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And then that spills over, of course. Well, firstly, the state of Israel, my goodness me, I mean, as Alexander Downer put it, those nominally once Christian nations are, roughly 87 or 88 of them, Muslim nations in the mid-50s. There's one Jewish state. Guess which one? All the haters want to get rid of. But more than that, we see this extraordinary idea that it's all right to demand the end of the Jewish state because we don't like Jews, and we take it out on Jews in other parts of the world. We don't do that to the Chinese because we don't like what the Communist Party in Beijing does. We don't do that to the Muslim countries because we don't like what happens in some Muslim countries. This is extraordinary stuff. I mean, it means that logic has gone as much as anything else.
There's an important definition of anti-Semitism, which is called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and it addresses that point by saying that if you can be critical of Israel in the same way as you're critical of any other country, that is not anti-Semitism. But if you take a completely different approach, a completely different set of standards, such as you've been talking about, it's the only one that falls into this category that gets this sort of treatment. Yes, it does cross the line. John, I want to show you a couple of images and ask for your comment, because we're seeing a conflation between almost every fashionable left-wing woke issue together with anti-Israel activism. And I'll just show two images very quickly. This is one of the crazy signs, Queers for Palestine, which you see in the protests. And as I'm sure everyone knows, the only country in the Middle East where gay and lesbians would be safe would be in Israel. And indeed, Tel Aviv hosts one of the largest gay and lesbian marches, except for this year because of the war. And then there's this one, which in some ways might be even more peculiar. Climate justice means free Palestine. I mean, it's mind-boggling. So what do you think might be going on here with all these, currently fashionable left-wing activism also integrated with the anti-Israel activism?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that it represents a massive cultural failure. We've not educated our young properly, and that, in particular, I'm afraid that missive has to be aimed at our universities right across the West. Not all of them, but the vast majority of them. They've been hopeless. They really have. I think, secondly, and it's related, we touched on it a moment ago, is the critical theory idea of victim and oppressor being the great fault line. So somehow or other, you can say, I'm a queer, I'm for a regime that would throw me off a tall building. I don't support a regime that would allow me to live in peace and even celebrate my lifestyle and have me as a member of its parliament, along, I might add, with other Arabs. There are 2 million Arabs, as I understand it, living in Israel today.
Mm.
Not many Jewish people would feel that they could live in some of their neighbouring countries at the moment, or that they'd be respected or be safe there. And I just think that what you've had here is an astonishing dumbing down, so that otherwise intelligent people are not able to rise above themselves long enough to see that this victim maker model, oppressor and oppressed model, is farcical. It's absolutely farcical. And I wonder whether any of these people ever wake up in the middle of the night and think, what an idiot I actually am. You know, it'd be like chickens saying, I'm for KFC.
Yeah, someone has drawn that analogy in the chat. And look, I hope they do wake up one day. I'm not sure what will cause it. But let's talk just a little bit further about what's happening on the universities.
Point there. You know,
Yep.
You hope they wake up one day. You know, when Auschwitz was finally captured, it's an interesting story, isn't it? Because the Americans really had the option of bombing it, which might have killed Jewish inmates at the time, but probably would have destroyed the camp and saved large numbers of other people because there wouldn't have been the gas ovens there. When the Americans freed it, I understand, they rounded up the Germans who lived in the surrounding towns and villages and marched them through Auschwitz so that they could see what it was done. And whether out of a sense of pathos or inadequacy or simple moral stupor, initially, apparently the Germans taken through were laughing. So the Americans rounded them up and took them all back through a second time, at which reality started to dawn. They started to understand just what they had, the standard they'd been in effect passing by. And to its great credit, Germany, by and large, has been deeply repentant. So people can change their minds. I do, going back to my point about irrationality, Augustine once commented something to the effect that we walk past magnificent lakes and look in awe. We walk through mountain ranges and we look and watch in awe. You know, we see great magnificent buildings and we watch in awe. We walk past another human being and pay no attention. What's happened to us that we have lost the sense of awe and amazement that another human being actually represents? What has happened to us?
Well, maybe it's let's reflect on education a little more, because it's said, I think, that if you want to know what your society is going to be like in the short, medium term, have a look at your universities. And if that is the assessment at the moment, it's a cause for concern. I'm sure you're aware of the Ramsay Foundation.
Absolutely.
Which was established by the legacy of Paul Ramsay. I knew Paul Ramsay a little bit through his involvement in private hospitals. And this was a centre in order to support the education of Western civilization in universities. But they've had a hell of a time, haven't they, John, trying to get universities to accept their largesse? What do you think's happening?
Well, we have academics at Sydney University, an incredible number of them all got together in the Great Hall, and their self-elected spokesman said something, as I recall, to the effect that the minute you hear the term Western civilization, you know you're talking about, racism and oppression and, colonialism and imperialism and cruelty to everybody else. I mean, well done. Well done. Just have a look at what you're now doing to good citizens who happen to be Jewish on your own campuses. It's very hard not to regard some of these people with, frankly, contempt.
There are, of course, a number of Islamic centres on our universities, and I guess at some level there's not a problem with alternate values also being in a spectrum of education. But it does seem to me more readily acceptable to have Arabic and Islamic centres on our universities than to have the Ramsay Foundation sponsor centres. So is there, and we also hear about the Chinese and the Confucius centres on our universities. What's your assessment of foreign influence on Australian universities?
I don't feel particularly qualified to comment other than to say that it's obviously quite extensive. And I think it goes back to the earlier remarks. I mean, it really does seem that academia will embrace almost anything which is the enemy of traditional Western beliefs and values. That seems to be the unifying. I mean, going right back to what I said at the beginning, you know, you've got the Chinese Communist Party, you've got you know, Iran, you've got Russia. They share nothing in common, and yet they look like allying themselves together over the one thing that they do share, which is a belief that the West is degenerate and divided and doesn't believe in itself anymore and is ripe for takeover. So, you know, they're pretty negative places to come from, but that's the only thing I can put it down to. Anything that will help us unpack, destroy this sort of terrible remaining, whatever's left of it. It's almost only a memory of what our civilization was based on. Now, you know, I suspect that I do want to say this, because I recently went back and spent some time with some young people at the university that I went to. I was delighted at how understanding they were once you started to work through these issues of, to be blunt, and just how badly taught they are, just how it's loaded with ideology. They see through it, they understand it. The problem is that we've allowed that void to develop. And part of the problem, I think, in Western universities and in Western culture is that the greatest generation now, by and large, has passed on, what the Americans call the greatest generation, those born between 1900 and 1930. They were the people who saw the world through the Great Depression, through the horrors of the Second World War, the enormously sobering impact, not just of the horrors of the battle, but of what had happened to the Jewish people. That had an enormously sobering impact on the Western world, and I think on any thinking people anywhere. Then, you know, the Cold War and so forth, they all basically started to pass out of academia in the mid-1990s and out of business and what have you. They were people who had vast experience, they had wisdom, they had humility. They knew how important it was to hear an alternative view and to follow Churchill's dictum that you know, when the evidence tells you that you're wrong, you change your mind. Whereas the modern model is that the evidence shows you that you're wrong when you harden down in your position and you shout louder. That's what you do. Let me have a slice both ways. If the people coming out of our universities at the moment get their hands on the levers of power in our culture, we really are finished unless they grow up in the meantime. You know, perhaps old people have always said that, but I think it to be really true now. And I had a globally recognized academic who teaches in one of the world's best universities make that very observation to me in America quite recently. I obviously won't name that person. But the upside is that the best, the cream, there's some emerging leadership there. And remember this, I often say this to make a point. The Oxford Pledge, 1933, February 1933, the Oxford Union debating that this House will under no circumstances fight for king and country, passed overwhelmingly, shockwaves through the West. Churchill always thought it encouraged Hitler to believe that he could get away with anything. The West didn't believe in itself anymore, wouldn't stand up and fight. Churchill was very deeply distressed. Only months later, he wrote that if we don't pass on our story, and he specifically mentioned religion and our beliefs. And back to what I was saying, Churchill, you know, went on to say that if we don't pass on our story properly, we do leave young people without a sense of place and purpose and direction, and open to Karl Marx's dictum that a people who are not taught the history are easily persuaded. The good side of the story is that with strong leadership, those young people, only 6 or 7 years later, were flying their Spitfires and their Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain. They were escorting convoys and manning merchant marine ships across the Atlantic to keep Britain supplied when Britain stood alone right through the war. They were there. They stood up with the right leadership, confronted with, to use a John Howardism, they were mugged by reality. So we must never despair, David. We must never despair. And I will say this, I've been very impressed at the measured, intellectually sound, considered interventions from many Jewish leaders over recent months in Australia. They've avoided hyperbole. They have made powerful moral and intellectual arguments. And I think that's been impressive. So that goes to leadership. We must not shirk in these terrible circumstances.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're going to move into questions in a moment. So if anyone has questions, you'll need to put your hand up.
Yep, so we've got a few questions. Yeah, everyone put your hand up and I will come to you.
And I'll just do our 1 minute promo this stage and then hand over to questions. So as we do each week, at the end of the event, if you are not yet supporting AJA, please go to the website, jewishassociation.org.au. Make sure you've subscribed to the email. And if you can, we do need tangible support. If you can make a donation or some other thing, that would be great. Just to let you know what's happening next week, we have as our guest Senator Michaela Cash, the Shadow Attorney General, and there is a very important piece of legislation in the pipeline concerning a new Religious Discrimination Act, and Michaela Cash will be briefing us on that. Robert's already met with her and tells us that it is a significant piece of legislation that we should be aware of. So over to questions.
Yeah, and just before we go to question time, two things people should know about. 10 a.m. tomorrow at the University of Sydney. We'll be there with Colonel Kemp, with a Holocaust survivor. So if anyone wants to come and show support for the Jewish students there, you're welcome to join us. The City Road entrance. And also everyone would have seen today across the Australian media, we've been calling out the disgraceful children's Hamas birthday party. So everyone take a look at that. It'll be in tomorrow's Daily Telegraph. It's on Sky News. And yeah, keep an eye out for that. Over to Courtney for the first question.
Need to unmute them.
Hi, John. I have a political question for you. In your perspective across all political parties from left to right in Australia, where do you think we're headed? Where do you think the wind is blowing and the momentum is shifting, if at all? And do you have hope, given your perspective on that we can right the ship?
No, I'm very worried about the fragmentation of politics. It's reflecting a society that's increasingly fragmented itself. And I think in the age of identity politics, there's reason to be really worried that it'll be increasingly difficult for any political party to really take charge, knuckle down together, the way that we did when we got into government. No one leaked, nobody divided, not everybody out there in the community loved what we were doing, but we weren't able to be split off from one another. And now, of course, everything's leaked out of cabinet. Well, not everything, but an awful lot is. It seems very hard for people to take firm positions without immediately being undermined by some of their own. My deep fear at the moment, my very deep fear, I didn't want to be party political tonight, but I have to say this. I think all the polls at the moment are suggesting that neither Labor nor the coalition will be able to form government after the next election. And the most likely outcome is a Labor, Green, Teal arrangement of some sort. Now, of course, you know that, well, I need hardly tell you about how challenging that might be. given the extraordinary rise of anti-Semitism in the left in this country. The fact that it's really perfectly obvious that one of the reasons that there's a lack of leadership from the Labor Party at the moment is that for base political reasons. Well, I don't need to elaborate. So I'm very, very worried about that. And well, again, just to press it a little bit further, I would have to say, I would urge your community to realize who your friends are. This is really, really, really important now. Where individuals and parties, you need to be very discerning, and you need to do what you can to support people who support a civilized Australia. I mean, I don't think there's any other way to put it, because we are drifting from civilization. We're becoming coarser and more divided and less trustworthy and more base at every turn. And here's the great irony. I thought that the left's great mantra was that they were against racism. Think BLM. We now know that they are consumed with hatred. One form of racism in particular. There's just no other way of putting it. Look, it would be easy to despair. I can only say we cannot give up while there's breath in our body. We just cannot. One of the admirable things about the Jewish community is that they did not play the victim card after the Holocaust. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs made that point to me in a wide-ranging conversation we had in London shortly before he died. What a great man he was. By the way, he also said that one of the great problems with our collapsing civilization is that we've forgotten the Jewish and Christian imperative to learn how to forgive. No relationships work without forgiveness. We're now a culture that's almost forgotten what forgiveness is. It's get even all the time. I said to Jonathan Sachs, what happens when we can no longer but forgive? And he said, we can only hope that people will forget, but in a social media age, they don't do that either.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Next up, we have...
It's not inevitable, but good people everywhere must now rally, really rally and engage. There's no time now for pulling punches. We have to, in a civilized way, not forgetting our own beliefs. Going back to my earlier remarks about how your leaders have intervened, we need to be very active on the battlefield. Otherwise, we will lose.
100%. We have noticed a really big shift in the Jewish community politically, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in future elections. Next up, we have Anne. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi guys. So I have two questions, but my first question is, which is the bigger threat to the West, the woke Marxists or the Islamic Jihad? And in regards to last Sunday, Never Again, I think it was the Jewish Council of Australia that condemned it. So what's going on with that? Because I know the event was hosted by Christians for Jews. I know that Zionists, Victoria, promoted the event as well. I know there are some Jewish community that promote this event. So why the infighting? That's all I'm just asking.
I'll answer the second question after John's answered the first.
Well, look, on the first, I think what I would say is that I actually think the greatest threat is neither of those. It's our own loss of belief and respect for the wellsprings of our civilization. It's our own self-loathing. That is the greatest threat. It's crippling us from tackling the other problems, where, in my view, we still have the mechanisms, we still have the machinery, we still have the firepower to resolve them. We lack the willpower. And no, I mean, it just breaks my heart to see that this country, which has not traditionally suffered from a lack of leadership on these sorts of things, is now pathetically blamongy.
Yeah.
And I think of Bob Hawke, he'd be rolling in his grave. He made that famous remark that when the bell tolls for Israel, it tolls for all mankind. And history reveals quite plainly that what he said was right.
John and everyone, I'll add to that, because we were in Parliament with Colonel Richard Kemp most of last week. Almost impossible to get to senior Labor people, but we met a couple of former senior Labor people, to the extent that they were cabinet ministers, but no more. One of them was Stephen Conroy. I gave him one of the AJA badges, which is the Australia-Israel badge, which he put on me, which, he wore proudly. And he made a comment to the effect that he was virtually apologetic about what some of his friends and colleagues have been saying and doing or not doing. There have been some very good people in Labor, but we're scratching around at the moment, and there's certainly been a shift of control. Michael Danby's called it out very vividly as well. But just briefly on your second question, there has unfortunately been in the Jewish community throughout history, from biblical times, Jews that have turned on the community. We saw it from Korach, who rebelled against Moses, right through to certain Jewish groups that worked with the Nazis, the largest being Der Verband National Deutsche Juden. We once had a guest on, probably a couple of years now, who wrote a book called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, a mind-boggling concept, but there were actually Jewish people who fought for Hitler in the Second World War. And we see it today. And there are some people in Australia who I would put in that category of being equivalent to Hitler's Jewish soldiers.
But we should also say the council or committee or whatever it is you mentioned, it's literally like two people who nobody's heard of. I think they started a few weeks ago, and they get a bit of airtime on taxpayer ABC, SBS, but obviously they don't really represent anyone. And yeah, perhaps some mental issues, who knows. All right, next up we have Debbie.
Hello. Great to talk to you, John. I just want to know, do you think that there's any way of turning the education system around?
We're finished if we don't. I find it unbelievable that ministers for education around the country seem to think it's acceptable to have ever declining academic outcomes. And according to the OECD, amongst the very worst classroom behaviour in the world, let alone turn a blind eye to the indoctrination that, and the poor curriculum that supports that indoctrination. I don't want to take the shot at teachers. This is part of what I see as our cultural death wish. We're quite profoundly anti-child. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And do I see any chance of turning it around? Well, we simply have to fight. There are good people. I'm deeply saddened that Alan Tudge, who really was getting a handle on what needed to be done, I think, at a federal level, is not there anymore and wasn't able to carry forward. He's left the parliament altogether, of course. But we do need people in that area in particular. If you take New South Wales, I mean, I think the education minister in New South Wales is probably one of the dozen or so most important ministers in the country. It's the biggest state. The education system is the biggest state by definition, 40% of the nation's kids. And yet New South Wales almost leads the pack in failure in educational outcomes, and no one seems to care. Don't we care about our kids? Don't we care about our future? Your question is entirely relevant, and I think the answer is that God only knows whether or not there'll be sufficient willpower found in time. But again, we have to keep trying. It's worth noting that parents seem to have got the buzz that there are a lot of problems, and they are going to almost any lengths now, to try and find better schooling for their children. I don't know why on earth that doesn't force governments to recognise they need to do a lot more than simply go on doubling the amount of money every 10 years or so, which is what we've done for education. Money isn't the problem.
Okay.
Next, we have Rachel.
Rachel, can you unmute?
Yeah,
No,
okay. Sorry about that. Thanks very much, John. It's really always good to hear you speaking. I mean, this is such an enormous problem that we are confronting. But I can only see that unless immigration policy is overhauled completely, and funding for higher education in particular is regulated so that Islamists cannot continue to pour money into Australian universities and colleges. And we really, I know it's a very, very unpopular, not politically correct view. We should not be having any more Muslim immigration into this country. And I think also we have, unfortunately, politicians who tiptoe around the dreadful behaviour of Muslim clerics here in Australia.
Dina, that's more than that's a whole set of questions. We'll let
okay, yeah. Look,
let John respond.
Yeah, I'm not looking for an answer to anything because I don't think it's going to come. But anyway, they're my concerns. Thank you.
I do think that it is astonishing that the Labor Party's been prepared. As a great advocate of a multicultural Australia. In fact, it was a Labor government that really pursued a multicultural policy in the first instance. But they can't see it. They're now basically smashing it. They're smashing it by not standing up against anti-Semitism. It will break the model and Australian people will lose confidence in it. And I'm a believer in a multiracial Australia. But I do not believe in subverting our own cultural values, the very things that gave rise to our freedoms and our prosperity that have attracted so many people here from other parts of the world. And so as I go back to my thesis, unless we're prepared to again re-embrace the well springs of our culture and our civilization, it is inevitable that it will continue to fade. And I was quite chilled by some words I heard the other day. I think it was Dennis Prager who said to me that Ernest Hemingway, when the famous author, went broke. May have gone broke more than once. He had an interesting life. But he was asked to describe the process of going broke. And he said, well, it starts very, very slowly. And in the end, it happens with terrifying speed.
Yeah. There's a particular aspect that we've called out very harshly recently, and that's the issuing of the 2,200 and something visas to bring people from Gaza in such great haste. It is impossible that security screening was adequately done, and it is a highly, highly radicalised population. So that'd be what I add. Who's next, Robert?
So we've just got a written question that's asking, so we're hearing all this negativity, but do you think if, and it's a big if there's a change of government in the United States or in Australia at the next elections, can this be reversed?
The United States first. I think one of the great worries there is that the way things are drifting, President Biden may be the last Democrat who strongly stands up for Israel. That really worries me. Given the way the left is going in America and the way in which the left, particularly the extreme left, seems to exercise such influence now over the Democratic Party. So that I think is quite a concern. Having said that, let's not lose sight of the fact that the American population remains very supportive of Israel. I don't know that I've seen any work on how strongly the Australian people support Israel, but plainly, many politicians and some political parties are virtually missing in action. I genuinely believe, look, I think the evidence is there. Peter Dutton has displayed courage and clarity. You must draw your own conclusions as to how effective he would be and whether or not he can win government. But you won't be surprised to know that I'm a very strong supporter of the coalition.
Yeah, and I think he's been, the coalition and Peter Dutton have been great friends to the Jewish community during this very difficult time. So we should acknowledge that. Next question, we have Dina.
need to unmute.
Thank you. The one big problem for us is going to always be the issue of free speech. And given the daily, nightly indoctrination through the media, through the television news, for example, with lies and half-truths and lacking of accurate information, how do you suggest that we deal with this, please?
It's a very good question. All of our freedoms, the four of them, that I sort of see our freedoms as being freedom of conscience and belief, freedom of speech, it's one by which we defend the other freedoms, freedom of assembly, and freedom to own property and to trade property, including your intellectual ability to earn a living. I see all of them, respected. I see a sort of a sad ignorance emerging in the community that somehow or other the government gifts these things to us, whereas in reality it's the other way around. We give to them only those things, those freedoms, which we need to give up for the good, the common good, or which we can't do best for ourselves. Subsidiarity again. How do we do this? The way we are trying to do it now, we have to be active on every front. We have to light spot fires wherever we can on the battlefield. We have to be active. We have to be courageous. We've got to argue the case. We must never give up. I think that the abuse of free speech is one of the reasons why support for it has diminished. And I have a personal theory. Apparently in around 2013 or 14, I think it was, you could actually pick the flip on American campuses from support for free speech to appropriate speech. Well, you know what that means. Who determines what's appropriate speech? And I think probably one of the large parts of the reasons for that was the sheer abuse on social media, the cesspit of social media, where people treat other people disgracefully. And then they start to think, oh, this free speech bit just seems to result in more hurt for me. And my response to that is to say we must, A, never give up, and B, we've got to stay out of the gutter. We have to stay out of the gutter. We must debate respectfully. We must always behave in a civilized way if we're trying to save our civilization. Not going to be easy. It's not easy at all. But as I say, I do think many of your spokesmen and women have done very well. So keep it up and be there all the time. Because every time you prick people's consciences, you claw some back and you reinforce the people who have never deserted you. And there are many of them. We must never forget that in many ways what we've got at the moment is a problem with elites. We always have to have leaders. It's just that too many of our elites at the moment, no other way of putting this, I'd suggest they're the wrong elites. Mm-hmm. Showing themselves to be unworthy.
Mm.
Next up, we have John Lockwood.
Thank you, Robert, and good to see you again, John and David. A couple of things, and I'll ask a question. John and David, are you aware of the newly formed Australian-Israel Allies Caucus that is being founded by Andrew Wallace and 23 members of Parliament at this stage?
We met with Andrew Wallace last week.
Fantastic. Again, we need to encourage our Labor friends to join with that caucus if we can and use our influence. And the real political hot potato at the moment, John, is the recognition of the Palestine state, and how do we influence the Liberal National Party to change its current policy from recognising two states? And what is your position on this? I know that's a hot potato, but it's one we have to address.
Well, I despair of the position that Australia has taken. I really do, particularly, whilst Hamas remains undefeated. I thought it was crassly irresponsible, and I think it rewards a group of people who do not deserve to be rewarded, namely Hamas and their utterly gutless leaders who hide away in places like Qatar, or if they are on the battlefield, they're somewhere in some luxurious villa underground with plenty of civilians standing between them and the IDF. I do think that I have to say to you that I just don't know how realistic a two-state solution is at the moment. I mean, everybody resorts to it when they're pressed on what do you think the answer is. But I think it goes back to this unbelievable brainwashing that we now know being carried out with the support of Western taxes of Palestinian children. I note that not many of the Muslim neighbours in that part of the world want to have too many Palestinians in their cabbage patch either.
Mm.
And so I have to say to you, I do not know what the answer is. I don't. It'd be disingenuous of me to say that I do. Ideally, it'd be lovely to have a two-state solution, but how many times has it been offered to the Palestinian people? And as my understanding is that Yasser Arafat, set the stage really by saying if I were to agree to that, I'd be dead tomorrow. Well, that tells you something pretty profound about the state of mind of the people in that area. And I don't want to sound unsympathetic to the terrible imagery of suffering people and what have you. But again, anybody with any moral compass at all would understand that just as the people who could have stopped the bombing of German, military installations and cities and so forth they used calling on the Allies, we wouldn't have called on them. It was up to the Nazi Party to stop it. They started it, and they were the people who could have stopped it. And this has been started by Hamas, and they're the people who could stop it. And that seems to be being overlooked. So, no easy answers at all, but I see no chance for peace in that part of the world for the Jewish people or the Palestinian people until Hamas is well and truly dealt with. And the sort of rather limp, let's have a ceasefire and what have you, nobody enjoys the imagery. Although, of course, we now know even the UN has cut in half, recognised that the blind acceptance of the Palestinian numbers claimed dead and injured was a very unwise thing to do. It turns out that the numbers have been much lower. The UN now, I gather, accepts that, and that there's been one civilian death for every Hamas death. I would have thought in the circumstances, I would have thought that was a pretty sobering figure. I'm not sure that you could say the same of many other campaigns to get rid of regimes in the past.
Exactly right.
And for those who've come along, we've had Colonel Richard Kemp, who've been taking around Australia, and that's exactly one of the points he makes, that the casualty rates in other conflicts that he's been in, whether Iraq, Afghanistan, for civilians are much higher than it is now. Next up, we have Robert.
Robert, we're not hearing you.
I think we might be having some issues with your sound. We'll come back to you. Let's try Anna.
There has been a two-state solution for it is now 100 years that Jordan, which was created by the British and French at the San Remo Conference, became a state. It was established to settle the Arab residents of Palestine. The Brits were then supposed to create an equal part of Palestine as the Jewish homeland. And of course, they caved to Arab oil. So it never happened. And can you imagine how many lives might have been saved of the 6 million had there been a place for them to go?
Yeah.
Anyway, it's more a statement than a question. I'm sorry. But nobody seems to know about the San Remo conference.
Oh,
No.
we do.
Well, no, ask around your brethren here. They don't. Anyway, that's me.
Yeah.
Henry Ergas has been brilliant on these things.
Yes, Henry's very good. He's been an AJ guest, excellent writer. Okay, Robert, let's try, see if your sound can work again. We're still having a bit of issues. Maybe we'll go to a written question while we're waiting. So we have here, someone's asked, why can't the Arab states resettle their brethren? Jordan consists of 75% of the land originally allocated to a Jewish state. I think maybe that's more of a statement.
Yeah, pretty much the same.
We've had another question. Sorry, David, what were you going to say?
I was going to ask John to comment on something that we actually discussed before the event started, but I think it's worth bringing out, and that is anti-Semitism as an indicator of the health or lack thereof in a society. That a rise in anti-Semitism historically means a society in decline. Is that a fair observation, John?
Well, I believe it is. It's always been the harbinger of wider conflict. And as Nehemiah put it, I think during the Second World War, first they came for the Jews, and they came for another group, and they came for someone else, and they came for me, and there was no one left. You know, hatred always begets hatred. It always expands after it. And history tells you that this is the oldest and most virulent form of racism of all. And whenever it's been allowed to spread, the results have been disastrous.
Yeah. And look, you might have not been quite as blunt as we have, but we have been bitterly disappointed in the current government. And indeed, some of the Teal candidates, which stood in electorates that have significant Jewish populations and promised that they would provide a certain level of support. And I think that a couple of those electorates might be vulnerable to change as a result in the next election, but we'll see.
Well, I'll simply make the observation that if I was a Jewish person, I would be doing everything I could to try and expose the sheer racism and hypocrisy, frankly, of many of the Greens.
No, Greens are dreadful.
We're seeking to expose the Teals as essentially being people who serve only to keep left-wing people in power, the people who have let you down. That's what they do. There's no getting away with it, no matter how well. I mean, and if I can be really blunt about this, they were elected on a basis of keeping the government honest. Well, that's been farcical, absolutely farcical. The first hurdle they fell at, which in my view was, you know, the abandonment of stage 3 of the tax cuts. And people might say, oh, that's all very well for you because, you know, you're paying a high rate of, and I freely admit that I am. But that isn't the point. That was an outrageous breach of trust. More particularly even than that, it means the end of tax reform in this country. It's a bad economic decision. Where were the Teals with their commitment to integrity? Nowhere to be seen. Nowhere to be seen. Their other great thing was climate. Well, they all live in seats where they're not going to be covered and smothered in turbines and, you know, solar panels, all of which have to be replaced after 15 to 20 years. And they don't depend on jobs, which are highly vulnerable to rising energy prices. It goes on and on and on. But where are they on the big issues like geopolitics, like racism, and the problems you're facing? Where are they on trade? Where are they on tax? Where are they on defence? This isn't good enough. A country that believes in itself will do a lot more right-brain thinking and a lot less left-brain thinking. And we are completely swamped with left-brain thinkers, you know, who are so intent upon dissecting their prey that they're not aware that they're about to become somebody else's dinner.
And that might be a good concluding point. Robert, do you have anything you want to add?
I know we've come up to time, so I want to give a big thank you. It's been a very intellectually stimulating conversation, and I'm sure on behalf of everyone, I want to say a big thank you to John Anderson, former Deputy Prime Minister. It's been a big honour to hear from you. Would you like to tell us how can people keep up to date with your podcast and the work you're doing?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to plug. Look, I do this with a friend. We've never monetized it. It's just a series of long-form conversations with good thinkers to try and make that thinking as accessible as possible to people to draw their own conclusions. I don't have a model of entrapment. I don't try not to run my agendas. Everybody knows what I think anyway. And they're long-form conversations. I have done 4 or 5 on on the rise of anti-Semitism. I've done Douglas Murray, Neil Ferguson, not all, it wasn't exclusively, but largely Dennis Prager, Victor Davis Hanson have all touched on it. There's one coming up with Alexander Downer, who's very strongly with you.
He's been a guest of ours and has been terrific. So
it's just johnanderson.net.au, or Google my name and gloss over the American country and Western singers, and you'll get to me and you'll find the conversations.
And I can, very highly recommend them. So thank you again so much. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We'll see you next week with the Shadow Attorney General, Senator Michaela Cash. Thank you again.